In the early hours of December 7, 1941, the world changed in a way no one in the United States had expected. Life that Sunday morning in Hawaii began like any other. The sun rose peacefully over Oahu, casting warm light across Pearl Harbor, where American battleships rested quietly in the water. Sailors prepared for routine duties or enjoyed breakfast. Some were still sleeping, unaware that within minutes their lives would be thrown into chaos. It was a calm morning, too calm for what was about to unfold. By the time the day ended, America would be thrust into the most devastating war in its history, a global conflict that would reshape nations and define generations. The attack on Pearl Harbor was more than a military strike. It was a shock that awakened a nation, stirred deep emotions, and set into motion events that would transform the world. For years leading up to that day, tensions between the United States and Japan had been escalating, though many Americans did not fully realize how serious the situation had become. Japan had been expanding aggressively throughout Asia, seeking resources to fuel its growing empire. The United States, hoping to slow this expansion without engaging in direct conflict, had placed strict economic sanctions on Japan, cutting off vital supplies like oil and steel. Japan felt cornered, believing its survival as a major power depended on securing resources in Southeast Asia. But Japan knew that any expansion risked confrontation with the United States, whose Pacific Fleet, stationed at Pearl Harbor, stood as a powerful barrier to their ambitions. While the U.S. government saw the rising tension, few imagined that Japan would launch a surprise attack thousands of miles away. Diplomats continued talking, newspapers debated war or peace, and many Americans believed that, even with rising global conflict, their homeland was too distant to be threatened. The horror of the First World War still lingered, and many hoped the United States would remain neutral. Yet behind the scenes, Japan's military planners were finalizing one of the most ambitious and daring operations in modern history. The goal was simple but dangerous: cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet with a surprise strike so devastating that America would be unable to interfere with Japan's expansion for at least 6 months. Those 6 months, Japan hoped, would be enough to secure its empire. Meanwhile, life in Hawaii moved at a relaxed pace. Pearl Harbor was a beautiful and strategically important base, but it was not treated like a battlefield. Many believed that if war ever came, Japan would strike the Philippines or British colonies in Asia, not Hawaii. The idea of an attack on American soil felt unrealistic. Military officials received reports suggesting possible Japanese aggression, but the warnings were often vague, conflicting, or misunderstood. The mindset at Pearl Harbor was one of routine and comfort. Ships were moored in predictable rows. Planes were parked wingtip to wingtip on airfields to prevent sabotage, ironically making them perfect targets for an aerial assault. Weapons were locked away. It was a peaceful stronghold, not a fortress ready for war. All of that changed around 7:55 a.m. on December 7. Without warning, Japanese aircraft swept toward the harbor in coordinated waves, engines roaring through the sky. The pilots had trained extensively for this moment. Some flew low over the water, torpedoes attached beneath their aircraft. Others flew high, carrying bombs designed to pierce battleship armor. The rising sun emblem on their wings glinted in the morning light. Sailors who noticed the approaching planes at first thought they were American aircraft returning from training until the first bombs fell. Explosions shook the ground, and thick black smoke began rising almost instantly. The attack was brutal and overwhelming. Battleships, once symbols of American strength, were turned into burning wrecks within minutes. The USS Arizona exploded with such force that it sent flames hundreds of feet into the air. The USS Oklahoma capsized, trapping hundreds of sailors inside. Aircraft on the ground were destroyed before they could take off. Barracks, airfields, hangars, and buildings erupted into flames. Communication systems faltered. Confusion spread fast. Many soldiers ran outside in whatever clothes they had been wearing, some in pajamas, trying to make sense of the chaos surrounding them. Despite the shock, countless acts of heroism unfolded that morning as sailors and soldiers fought back amid fire, smoke, and destruction. By the time the attack ended, less than 2 hours later, more than 2,400 Americans were dead, thousands more wounded, and much of the Pacific Fleet lay damaged or sunk. It was a day of immense loss and disbelief. Cities across the United States listened in stunned silence as radio broadcasts delivered the devastating news. Families feared for loved ones stationed in Hawaii. Newspapers rushed to print extra editions. Crowds gathered around radios. The nation felt wounded, betrayed, and unprepared. December 7th was no longer just another Sunday. It had become a moment of history that would forever be remembered. But the attack did more than cause destruction. It sparked unity and determination within America. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt addressed the nation the following day with the now famous words, "A date which will live in infamy." His speech rallied the American people, transforming shock into strength and grief into resolve. Congress declared war on Japan almost immediately. Young men rushed to enlist in the military. Factories across the country began converting to war production. Women entered the workforce in record numbers. Communities organized scrap drives, rationed food and materials, and threw their full support behind the war effort. The United States, once divided on whether to enter the war, now stood united with a powerful sense of purpose. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a turning point, not only for the United States, but for the entire world. It led to America's full-scale entry into World War II, transforming the conflict and shifting the balance of power. What began as a tragedy became a driving force behind one of the largest mobilizations in human history. American soldiers would go on to fight in Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. The war would demand sacrifice, courage, and resilience from millions of people. And despite the heavy cost, it would ultimately reshape the global order for decades to come. Yet behind the large numbers and historical milestones, the attack remains deeply human. It is the story of the sailors who woke up expecting a peaceful morning and found themselves in the middle of unimaginable terror. It is the story of families back home who listened anxiously for updates. It is the story of a nation that believed it was safe, only to learn how quickly peace can shatter. Above all, it is a reminder that history can change in a single morning, through decisions made far away, through tensions gradually rising, or through one unexpected moment that alters the course of time. In the years preceding the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Pacific region simmered under a buildup of political pressures, imperial ambitions, and deep ideological divides that spread like invisible fissures beneath the surface of international diplomacy. Japan, a nation that had rapidly evolved into a formidable industrial and military power, sought to expand its dominance across East Asia and secure resources essential for sustaining its growing empire. This expansionist desire was not born overnight. It had taken root earlier in the century as Japan modernized its military and economy, observing how Western powers carved spears of influence across Asia. Japanese leaders believed it was their right, perhaps even their destiny, to solidify their own place on the world stage. As tensions rose, the Pacific Ocean slowly shifted from a tranquil expanse of trade routes into a boiling arena of potential conflict, shadowed by looming confrontation. The United States, too, had vested interests in the region, viewing Japan's advances with increasing concern, especially as they threatened American territories, trade networks, and long-standing alliances. The Pacific, vast and seemingly calm, became the background to a brewing storm of diplomatic breakdowns, military posturing, and clashing national visions that would eventually culminate in one of the most shocking moments in modern military history. By the early 1930s, Japan had already begun asserting its influence aggressively, starting with the invasion of Manchuria in 1931. The world watched in disbelief as the Japanese military swept across Chinese territory with speed and precision, signaling a dangerous shift in regional dynamics. This invasion marked Japan's first major step toward continental expansion and tested the reactions of world powers. The League of Nations, created after World War I to preserve global peace, condemned Japan's actions, but lacked the authority to enforce its resolutions. Japan withdrew from the League, signaling its willingness to pursue a path of unilateral military action unfettered by international oversight. Over the following years, Japan intensified its campaign in China, culminating in the devastating events of the Second Sino-Japanese War. Cities like Nanjing bore witness to atrocities that shocked the global conscience, and reports of brutality reached Washington, influencing U.S. perceptions of Japanese ambitions. The United States, committed to supporting Chinese sovereignty and concerned about its economic interests, began contemplating how to curb Japan's rapid expansion without engaging in direct conflict. Diplomatic protest notes were exchanged, trade negotiations faltered, and tensions mounted. Still, the Pacific held its fragile equilibrium, even as Japan's military machine grew bolder, and American strategists recognized that a clash, whether intentional or accidental, might be inevitable. Economically, Japan faced critical challenges that further fueled its aggressive maneuvers. As an island nation with limited natural resources, Japan depended heavily on foreign imports, particularly oil, steel, and rubber, materials essential to maintaining its industrial and military strength. The United States, possessing vast natural reserves, became one of Japan's primary suppliers of these commodities. However, the relationship between the two nations grew increasingly strained as Japan's actions in China continued to escalate. American leaders, including President Franklin D. Roosevelt, viewed Japan's expansionism with deep concern, fearing that unchecked aggression would destabilize the entire Pacific region. In response, the United States began implementing economic sanctions designed to restrict Japan's access to vital resources. These restrictions, though gradual at first, were intended to pressure Japan into halting its military campaigns. Instead, they had the opposite effect. Japanese leaders interpreted the sanctions as attempts to strangle their empire and prevent Japan from securing a position as a global power. Each embargo, each tightened regulation, each diplomatic rebuke further deepened Japan's suspicions and resentment. The nation found itself cornered, facing a critical decision: yield to U.S. demands and retreat from China, or find another way to secure the resources necessary to sustain its expansionist goals. The path Japan ultimately chose would change the course of history. As diplomatic talks continued in the waning months of 1941, a profoundly different operation was already taking shape within the inner military circles of the Japanese Empire. Behind heavy doors, away from the political pleasantries and carefully worded messages exchanged with Washington, Japan's most powerful military strategists were designing a plan that would not simply counter American influence in the Pacific, but attempt to redefine the balance of power entirely. For Japan, the need for decisive action had transformed from a strategic consideration into a matter of national survival, at least as the militarists perceived it. The oil embargo imposed by the United States had begun to suffocate the empire's operational capabilities, threatening its grip on newly seized territories and its ambitions for further expansion across Southeast Asia. Japanese commanders understood that time was slipping away, their fuel reserves were finite, their diplomatic efforts stagnant, and their aspirations dependent on access to resources they no longer controlled. Under these dire constraints, the concept of a preemptive strike, bold, devastating, and executed with absolute precision, began to crystallize. It was a strategy that many feared, but few could openly challenge. The conception of the plan that would eventually bring destruction to Pearl Harbor can be traced to the enigmatic and visionary mind of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet. Yamamoto was no ordinary military leader. He had studied in the United States, understood American culture, and recognized the immense industrial capacity that lay across the Pacific. While many in Japan believed the United States to be weak, distracted by European conflicts, or unwilling to commit to another major war, Yamamoto saw a sleeping giant, one that, if provoked, would rise with overwhelming force. Yet even with this understanding, he believed Japan had only one chance to win a war against the United States. Deliver a shock so powerful, so paralyzing, that the Americans would have no choice but to negotiate peace from a position of weakness. This belief did not arise from arrogance, but from a calculated assessment of Japan's capabilities. Japan could not win a prolonged war. It could not match American shipbuilding, industrial manpower, or technological output. But it could land a devastating blow early, one that would buy precious months, perhaps even years, during which Japan could secure vital territories and fortify defensive lines across the Pacific. If Japan controlled enough territory, Yamamoto argued, America might hesitate to launch the massive campaigns necessary to dislodge them. This strategic logic formed the backbone of the Pearl Harbor Plan. Yet Yamamoto's vision was met with skepticism within Japanese military leadership. The Imperial Army and Navy often clashed over priorities, resources, and strategic philosophies. Many officers, particularly those in the Naval General Staff, argued that Japan should focus not on an audacious strike against Hawaii, but on consolidating its positions in Southeast Asia and preparing for defensive confrontations. Some believed the risk of attacking Pearl Harbor was too great, that failure would be catastrophic, and that success might still provoke the very American fury Yamamoto sought to avoid. But Yamamoto would not be deterred. He threatened to resign if his plan was rejected, a powerful statement from Japan's most respected admiral. Faced with this ultimatum, the High Command reluctantly agreed to proceed. With approval secured, Yamamoto entrusted the detailed planning and execution of the operation to a select group of naval officers, engineers, and aviators who would refine every aspect of the attack, from aircraft formations to torpedo modifications. What began as a conceptual proposal quickly evolved into a multifaceted military blueprint, one that required secrecy, innovation, discipline, and unity of purpose on an unprecedented scale. One of the greatest technical challenges that Japanese planners faced was the problem of Pearl Harbor's shallow waters. Standard aerial torpedoes plunged too deep upon release, burying themselves in the seabed rather than striking ship holes. Without a solution, a critical component of the attack, the disabling of America's battleships, would fail. Japanese engineers, however, proved resourceful. They developed special wooden fins for their torpedoes, allowing them to glide along the surface upon release before striking downward. This innovation transformed an impossible scenario into a viable option. Similar ingenuity went into modifying bombs capable of piercing the armored decks of American warships. These specialized weapons were forged from repurposed naval artillery shells, hardened and reshaped to maximize penetration. Yamamoto and his planners knew that every detail mattered. Nothing could be left to chance, not when the fate of the empire hung in the balance. Training for the operation became an exercise in absolute precision. Pilots practiced relentlessly, refining their timing, formations, and attack paths until they could execute their maneuvers with near-perfect coordination. Aircrews learned how to navigate long distances over open ocean, using only mathematical calculations, magnetic bearings, and subtle environmental cues. Radio silence was mandatory. Discovery would invite failure. Meanwhile, Japanese spies in Hawaii sent coded reports on U.S. ship placements, airfield conditions, and defensive readiness. These agents blended into local communities, posing as shopkeepers, students, or workers. Through careful observation, they gathered crucial intelligence without arousing suspicion. Every detail, how ships were moored, when patrol planes launched, when radar stations operated, was analyzed and incorporated into the attack plan. By early November 1941, preparations had reached their final stages. 6 aircraft carriers, the core of Japan's elite striking force, were assembled into the Kido Butai, the most powerful naval aviation fleet the world had ever seen. Under the command of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, this task force was prepared to sail into the North Pacific under a veil of secrecy. The fleet included destroyers, cruisers, submarines, and supply ships, all coordinated to support the carriers and ensure the long journey remained undetected. Meanwhile, Japanese diplomats in Washington continued peace negotiations, unaware of the exact details of the military plan, but aware enough to sense that time was running out. Tokyo kept them intentionally uninformed, maintaining the illusion of diplomacy until the final moments. The goal was not to achieve peace, but to delay American suspicion for as long as possible. Every hour gained through diplomatic exchanges allowed the Kido Butai to move closer to its launching point north of Hawaii. The deception extended far beyond the diplomatic front. Japanese communication networks implemented elaborate schemes to hide fleet movements. False signals were broadcast from ports in Japan to create the illusion that major warships remained docked even as they sailed toward the Pacific. Orders were delivered orally, limiting the number of written communications that could be intercepted. Even within Japan, few officials understood the full extent of the plan. The secrecy was so strict that some naval leaders did not learn of the operation until the final days before departure. This atmosphere of compartmentalization ensured operational security but also created tensions. Many commanders, including Nagumo, privately doubted aspects of the plan. Nagumo believed that the operation carried excessive risk and that Japan's future depended too heavily on Yamamoto's gamble. Yet duty, hierarchy, and loyalty prevailed. By late November, the fleet set sail under strict radio silence, entering the vastness of the Pacific with a mission that would soon shock the world. The sky over the northern Pacific was still cloaked in pre-dawn darkness when the pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy climbed into their aircraft, their breath visible in the cold air as they prepared for a mission that would change the world. The carriers of the Kido Butai, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, cut through the waves with silent purpose, their decks bustling as crews completed final checks. Engines rumbled to life across the fleet, vibrations running through the steel hulls like a heartbeat growing faster and louder. For months they had trained relentlessly, rehearsed this moment in secrecy, memorized flight patterns, attack routes, and assignment orders. Now, on the morning of December 7, 1941, everything they had prepared for was about to unfold. Across the Pacific, the island of Oahu slept under the illusion of peace, unaware that hundreds of miles away, an armada had positioned itself to deliver the most devastating strike the United States had ever faced. The men in the cockpits knew the magnitude of what they were about to do. Some were filled with confidence, others anxiety, but all understood that history would judge their actions. As the first light of dawn glimmered faintly at the horizon, the order finally came. Flight deck crews moved swiftly, signaling pilots into position. Planes were lined up meticulously. Fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers arranged so that takeoff could proceed without hesitation. At precisely 6 a.m., Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, tasked with leading the first wave, climbed into his Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber aboard the Akagi. With calm determination, he fastened his harness, checked his instruments, and glanced at the rows of aircraft behind him. He knew that hundreds of men were depending on his leadership, and thousands of Japanese soldiers across Asia awaited the outcome of this day. Fuchida raised his hand, and deck crews acknowledged the signal. The carrier's engines surged, wind whipped across the deck, and one by one planes began rolling forward. The first aircraft raced down the narrow runway and lifted into the cold air. Then another, and another. Over 180 aircraft would ascend into the sky within minutes, forming the first wave of attackers headed straight for Oahu. Back at Pearl Harbor, the scene could not have been more different. It was a peaceful Sunday morning, and the base was quiet. Most servicemen were still asleep, while others prepared for church or leisurely activities. Battleships lined Battleship Row in perfect formation, their flags reflecting in the calm harbor waters. The USS Arizona, the USS Oklahoma, the USS West Virginia, and the USS California rested in their berths, their crews assuming that the greatest threat to American interests lay thousands of miles away in the Philippines or perhaps in Southeast Asia, not here in the middle of the Pacific. At nearby airfields like Hickam, Wheeler, and Bellows, American aircraft sat wing to wing, tightly grouped to avoid possible sabotage, a decision that would later prove devastating. Radar operators, including George Elliott and Joseph Lockard, monitored their screens early that morning and noticed an unusually large formation approaching from the north. Assuming it was a scheduled arrival of American B-17s, they dismissed the detection. Warnings, though sent, carried no urgency. No alarm sounded. The base remained wrapped in its untroubled morning calm. As the first wave of Japanese planes neared Oahu, they descended through scattered clouds, revealing a breathtaking view of the island's mountains and coastlines. Fuchida, observing from above, saw Pearl Harbor emerge below, quiet, undisturbed, and filled with neatly arranged battleships and aircraft. It was exactly as the intelligence reports had described. The ships were moored in predictable positions, the airfields appeared unguarded, and there was no sign that the Americans anticipated an attack. Fuchida raised his signal flags and gave the order to his formation to prepare for assault. His voice crackled across the radio as he transmitted the infamous message, "Tora, Tora, Tora," the prearranged code indicating that complete surprise had been achieved. The Japanese pilots, hearing the message, tightened their grips on their controls. They knew now that the attack would unfold as planned, with the element of surprise granting them a decisive, if brutal, advantage. Below them, the city of Honolulu was just beginning to stir. Early morning fishermen cast nets into the sea. Families prepared breakfast, and military personnel went about their routines with no hint of the storm descending upon them. The first bombs fell at approximately 7:55 a.m. as torpedo bombers skimmed the water toward Battleship Row. Their engines roared as they released torpedoes specially modified to glide across the shallow harbor. The torpedoes sped toward the anchored battleships, leaving trails of white foam in their wake. Seconds later, they slammed into their targets with explosive force. The USS Oklahoma was hit first, multiple torpedoes tearing into her hull, causing the massive ship to roll violently. Within moments, it began to capsize. Sailors scrambled across the deck, shouting orders, trying to escape the rising water as the ship slowly turned onto its side. Nearby, the USS West Virginia and the USS California also suffered direct hits, their hulls cracking under the impact. Towering columns of water and debris erupted into the air, painting the once tranquil harbor with chaos. Japanese high-level bombers then swooped down, releasing armor-piercing bombs that plummeted toward the battleships just as the torpedoes struck from below. The USS Arizona suffered the most catastrophic hit. A bomb pierced her deck and detonated her forward magazine, igniting hundreds of thousands of pounds of gunpowder. The explosion was massive, so violent that it lifted the ship out of the water and sent a fireball soaring into the sky. The shock wave rippled across the harbor, shattering windows miles away. Over 1,000 men aboard the Arizona were killed instantly, many entombed forever within the sinking vessel. The first minutes after the attack on Pearl Harbor were a blur of sound, smoke, fear, and disbelief. For those on the ground, the world seemed to collapse without warning. People who had been enjoying a calm Sunday morning, preparing breakfast, relaxing in their quarters, or getting ready for church, were suddenly thrown into chaos as explosions shook the earth and flames tore through the sky. The attack had come so suddenly that many did not understand what was happening until they saw the rising sun insignias on the Japanese aircraft diving toward them. The shock of seeing enemy planes in the skies above Hawaii seemed unreal, like something from a nightmare or a distant war in another country. But this was real, and the destruction was immediate. Across the harbor, the first waves of bombs and torpedoes hit battleships lined neatly along Battleship Row. The USS Arizona was struck by a massive armor-piercing bomb that ignited the forward magazines, causing a blast so powerful it lifted the ship out of the water. The explosion sent a column of fire and smoke hundreds of feet into the air and shattered windows across the base. More than 1,000 sailors were killed instantly, and the ship sank in minutes. Nearby, the USS Oklahoma was hit by multiple torpedoes that tore open its hull. The ship began to roll over, trapping hundreds of sailors inside. Some survived long enough to bang on the hull, signaling for help, but many could not be reached in time. The USS West Virginia, USS California, and others were struck again and again, each explosion sending shockwaves through the harbor and shaking people who were still trying to understand what was happening. Smoke quickly filled the sky. Thick black clouds from burning oil rose from the water as the ships leaked fuel that ignited and spread across the surface. The harbor itself seemed to be on fire. The air was hot and heavy, carrying the smell of burning metal, fuel, and destruction. The noise was overwhelming, engines roaring overhead, bombs whistling as they fell, explosions erupting everywhere, and the desperate shouts of men calling for help. The simple routines of daily life had been shattered in seconds. The immediate aftermath was filled with confusion. Many officers and sailors rushed outside still wearing whatever clothes they had on, some in pajamas, others in undershirts or half-dressed uniforms. No one had time to prepare. They grabbed anything they could find to defend the base. Some ran to anti-aircraft guns, but many of the guns were locked or had no ammunition nearby because it was a peaceful Sunday morning. Others used rifles, pistols, or even machine guns from grounded aircraft to shoot at the sky. Many of the early shots were uncoordinated, fired out of fear, anger, and desperation. Medical personnel rushed into action with little equipment and almost no warning. Hospitals were quickly filled with wounded sailors and civilians, people burned by explosions, hit by flying debris, injured by collapsing structures, or suffering from smoke inhalation. Some had severe burns from the oil fires, their clothes and skin coated in thick black residue. Others had broken bones or deep cuts caused by shrapnel. Doctors, nurses, and volunteers worked without rest, improvising treatments, tearing sheets into bandages, and converting hallways and offices into makeshift emergency rooms. Even with all their effort, the number of wounded far exceeded the available resources. Amid the destruction, acts of bravery took place everywhere. Sailors jumped into burning water to pull their comrades out. Crews worked in unbearable heat to rescue men trapped inside sinking ships. Some climbed through smoke-filled compartments, guided only by shouting voices or the tapping of trapped survivors. Others formed bucket lines to fight fires or carried ammunition to gun crews who were desperately trying to shoot down Japanese planes. Ordinary men were forced to make extraordinary decisions within seconds, often risking their lives to save others. Many later said that they did not feel fear in those moments, only the need to act. The attack also spread beyond the harbor. Airfields such as Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, and Bellows Field were hit hard. Japanese planes targeted runways and aircraft lined up neatly in rows, destroying dozens of planes on the ground before they could take off. Barracks were bombed, killing soldiers who had not yet fully woken up. Hangars burned, sending flames and smoke into the sky. Those who survived had to run for cover, dodge strafing gunfire, and try to find weapons to defend themselves. Some pilots managed to take off in damaged planes, climbing into the sky to fight back, even though they were outnumbered in flying aircraft that were barely operational. Communication lines were disrupted, and rumors spread quickly. Some believed that the Japanese were landing troops on the beaches. Others thought that submarines were attacking from offshore. The base's leadership struggled to gather accurate information because the attack was still happening and no one knew whether more waves were coming. The confusion added to the fear, and people prepared themselves for anything. Civilians across Honolulu also heard explosions and saw smoke rising over the harbor. Many did not know what was happening until radio broadcasts confirmed that the islands were under attack. Streets filled with people trying to take cover, protect their families, or simply understand what was happening. When the attack finally ended, silence settled over Pearl Harbor, but it was not a peaceful silence. It was heavy and filled with shock. The water was covered with oil, debris, and the remains of battleships that had been the pride of the U.S. Navy. Fires still burned across the harbor and at airfields. The smell of smoke lingered everywhere. Men who had survived walked in a daze, covered in soot and oil. Some searched for friends who had not returned. Others sat quietly, trying to process the horror they had just witnessed. The scale of destruction was far greater than anyone had imagined possible. The immediate hours after the attack were filled with urgent work. Rescue teams searched for trapped survivors inside capsized ships. Engineers and sailors worked to put out fires that still threatened to spread. Bodies had to be recovered and identified, a heartbreaking and difficult task. Medical personnel continued treating the wounded, many of whom were in critical condition. Commanders met to assess the damage and plan the next steps. The base was put on high alert in case the enemy returned. Everyone knew that the world had changed completely in just a few hours. Even as the sun set that day, the destruction at Pearl Harbor remained frighteningly visible. Battleships lay sunk or heavily damaged. Aircraft lay in ruins across airfields. Smoke still rose from burning buildings and ships. Families worried about loved ones who had been on duty. The sense of security that had existed before the attack was gone, replaced by fear, uncertainty, and grief. People understood that life would not return to normal anytime soon. The attack had left deep scars, emotional and physical, that would remain long after the fires were extinguished. Yet in the middle of this devastation, there was also a growing feeling of unity and determination. Those who had witnessed the attack felt a powerful sense of duty to protect their country. They helped one another, comforted the wounded, and worked tirelessly to rebuild what had been destroyed. Although shocked and heartbroken, the people of Pearl Harbor displayed remarkable strength and courage in the face of overwhelming tragedy. The immediate aftermath of the attack was filled with destruction, but it was also the beginning of a new resolve, one that would shape the course of the war and the future of the nation. The attack on Pearl Harbor did more than destroy battleships and airfields. It shook the entire nation to its core. Within hours, news of the attack spread across the United States, carried first by frantic radio broadcasts and then by newspapers rushing to print special editions. For many Americans, the initial reaction was disbelief. Some thought the reports were exaggerated or mistaken, but as more details emerged, the truth became painfully clear. The country had been struck by a powerful enemy, and the illusion of safety that had long shielded the nation was shattered. People who had never before thought about global conflict suddenly found themselves absorbed in every update, listening closely to every report, unsure what might come next. Fear, confusion, and anger filled homes across the country, but alongside these emotions came a growing sense of unity, a feeling that the whole nation was now facing a common threat. President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed the nation the next day, calling December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. His voice, steady and filled with determination, echoed across radios in living rooms, kitchens, schools, and workplaces. Americans listened as he described the devastation at Pearl Harbor and the calculated aggression of Japan. His speech transformed shock into purpose. It was no longer a distant war. This was now a battle for survival, one that would require every citizen to contribute. Congress quickly declared war, and the United States officially entered World War II. The nation, once divided on whether to join the conflict, was now united in a way it had never been before. In the days following the attack, enlistment offices across the country were overwhelmed. Young men lined up for blocks, eager to join the military and defend their country. Some were motivated by patriotism, others by anger, and many by a desire to protect their families and nation from further harm. Those who had previously been uncertain about joining the armed forces now volunteered without hesitation. Recruiting offices extended hours, processed thousands of applications daily, and still could not keep up with the demand. The military rapidly expanded. New units were formed, training camps were established, and resources were poured into building the strongest fighting force the United States had ever assembled. At the same time, the government began organizing a massive war mobilization effort. Factories that once produced cars, appliances, or household goods were swiftly converted into wartime manufacturing centers. Assembly lines that previously rolled out automobiles now built tanks, aircraft, and weapons. Industrial workers, men and women, learned new skills, operating heavy machinery and assembling complex equipment. The nation's industrial power became one of its greatest strengths. Production increased rapidly, surpassing even the expectations of military planners. The speed and efficiency with which American factories adapted to wartime demands surprised not only the country itself, but also its allies and enemies across the world. Women played a crucial role in this mobilization. With many men joining the military, women entered the workforce in record numbers. They became welders, mechanics, engineers, and factory laborers. Posters encouraging women to support the war effort appeared across the country, and figures like Rosie the Riveter became symbols of national strength and determination. Women balanced demanding jobs with responsibilities at home, proving that they were essential to the nation's success. Their contributions reshaped society and paved the way for future generations. On the home front, Americans quickly adjusted to a new way of life. Rationing became a part of daily routine. Sugar, gasoline, rubber, meat, and other essential items were carefully distributed. Families saved every scrap of metal, collected rubber, and conserved fuel to support the war effort. Victory gardens appeared in backyards and parks, providing fresh vegetables and reducing pressure on the national food supply. Children helped by gathering tin cans, newspapers, and other materials that could be recycled. Communities came together, sharing resources and supporting one another as the nation prepared for a long and difficult conflict. Propaganda played a major role in keeping morale high. Posters encouraged citizens to do your part, buy war bonds, and loose lips sink ships. These messages reminded people that their actions at home mattered just as much as those of soldiers overseas. Schools taught children about patriotism and national duty, while radio programs and films portrayed American bravery and unity. The entertainment industry worked closely with the government to spread messages of resilience and hope. Many Hollywood actors enlisted, boosting public support and inspiring others to follow their example. The nation also dealt with fear and suspicion during this time. Concerns about espionage and sabotage led to intense scrutiny of certain groups, especially Japanese Americans. Unfortunately, this fear resulted in the forced relocation and internment of more than 100,000 people of Japanese descent, most of whom were American citizens. They were removed from their homes, businesses, and communities and sent to internment camps across the western United States. This decision, driven by fear rather than evidence, remains one of the darkest moments in American history. Even as the country united against a common enemy, these injustices cast a shadow over the broader mobilization effort. Despite challenges, the overall spirit of unity grew stronger. Americans wrote letters to soldiers overseas, donated supplies, and participated in community drives. Churches, schools, and organizations hosted events to raise money for war bonds. Every small act was seen as a contribution to the nation's mission. Newspapers published stories of heroism from Pearl Harbor, honoring those who fought bravely and those who lost their lives. These stories fueled determination, reminding the country why the war effort mattered. The military, meanwhile, rebuilt rapidly. Damaged ships from Pearl Harbor were raised, repaired, or salvaged for parts. New ships were constructed at astonishing speed, and aircraft production soared. The United States prepared to wage war on two fronts, Europe and the Pacific. The attack on Pearl Harbor had awakened a sleeping giant, and now that giant was mobilizing with extraordinary energy. Generals and admirals developed new strategies, while scientists and engineers designed advanced weapons and technologies. Every part of the nation was focused on one goal: victory. As months passed, the shock of Pearl Harbor transformed into a deep resolve. Families adjusted to letters from the front, ration books, and long work hours. Soldiers trained tirelessly, preparing for the battles that lay ahead. The nation's spirit was tested, but it remained unbroken. Pearl Harbor had been a devastating blow, but it had also ignited a unity that few had imagined possible. Americans felt a shared purpose: to defend freedom, protect their homeland, and ensure that such an attack would never happen again. The legacy of Pearl Harbor shaped every part of American life during the war. It influenced policies, fueled determination, and strengthened the belief that the nation could overcome any challenge. The attack awakened a sense of responsibility in every citizen, from factory workers to soldiers, from children to the elderly. It was a moment that changed history and set the stage for America's rise as a global power. From tragedy came mobilization, transformation, and a united commitment